What other better way to follow up on the previous zyzz video, whose greatest selling point is the topic of aesthetics, than to create a sort of tutorial video on how the average layman in today's day and age can aspire to work towards one of the most coveted fitness goals for the majority of lifters, and that is of course an aesthetic physique. An aesthetic physique is one that typically conveys a balance of muscle mass and relatively lower body fat to the point where the emphasis is mostly put on maintaining a V silhouette. A V silhouette has long been hailed as the holy grail of what makes the physique truly aesthetic in the eyes of most of the general population. It signifies virility, strength, health, and just a primal way of displaying masculine energy. You could quite literally make a social experiment out on the streets and show random pedestrians pictures of a physique from powerlifting, from strongman, from open division bodybuilding, and various other strength sports, and then sprinkle in just one physique with an emphasis on the V silhouette. And I guarantee you the V silhouette physique is going to be raking in most of the votes. On which one is the most attractive? The reason why this is the case is because, contrary to what most gym rats think, the opposite sex cares very little about you maxing out your muscular potential, and instead the emphasis is put on just a balanced, proportionate physique that's also capable. That's just it, really. The way we can go about attaining this aesthetic look is by putting most of our efforts into two significant pillars of the aesthetic physique, as I'd like to call it, and they're as follows. Firstly, the emphasis should be on maintaining a body fat look that errs more on the lower end of the 10 to 15% body fat spectrum. This can vary as some individuals have better fat storage disposals than others, and can get away with maintaining a higher body fat look whilst still looking aesthetic. It comes down to genetics, unfortunately. The best way to gauge this is by looking at various body fat examples found online to firstly educate yourself what 10, 12, 15% body fat looks like on most individuals, and then make a plan to follow. A general rule of thumb, but at least in my experience, is to stay under the 15% body fat threshold and adjust as needed. A common misconception is that you need to be under 10% body fat to maintain this appearance, which is false for two reasons. Firstly, the vast majority of drug-free lifters will start to look way too deflated, as when you dip under into the single digits, your hormones start to fight against you, and you start to severely hamper your ability to recover from your workouts, which translates to lost muscle and an increase in stress-releasing cortisol hormone. The list just goes on. The average guy that works full-time or study will have an impossible uphill battle to fight against if he tries to maintain this shredded look. As such, much like I have mentioned previously, it is enough to play around in the 10 to 15% body fat range and figure out where you can maintain this aesthetic look without hampering your daily life. The second big pillar to the aesthetic look is, of course, muscle mass itself. This is a big one. The average guy today is stuck in the feedback loop of, as you'd call it, perma-cutting, to the point where they just keep a calorie deficit in hopes of getting that shredded look without the base layer of muscle mass to follow along with it, which just keeps them skinny for the most part. As such, if you're a beginner, you need to focus anywhere between 2 to 3 years minimum on building at least 20 to 25 pounds of actual contractile tissue on your frame. If you're of course starting as a beginner, before you can even consider doing a calorie deficit into that 10 to 15% body fat range. Once you're in that group of lifters that looks like they lift, quote unquote, be it in a shirt or without, it's safe to say that if you're in that 20+% body fat range and you want to peak for summer and whatnot, it does make sense to enter a calorie deficit and finally aspire towards the aesthetic look. A great way to know if it makes sense for you to do a calorie deficit or not is by making sure that your BMI doesn't drop near the lower end of the healthy spectrum, as most trained individuals typically sport an overweight BMI, which isn't technically unhealthy due to the extra muscle mass, and most guys that can pull off the aesthetic look typically sport a body weight that is usually closer to the overweight range than the other end of the healthy range, which is also completely normal. Once you have these two pillars in order, you're on your way to pulling off the look most of the general population would admire, regardless of the kind of outlook they have on bodybuilding in general. As a matter of fact, most people would agree the aesthetic look is actually probably the most well-rounded in terms of just dating, value, sports, and general health.